A typical evening, tea, girlfriends, nothing foreshadowed trouble. The light bulbs suddenly began to flicker. The girls fell silent and looked up. The first alarm. The house had awakened. Susie began to tremble. The hum grew louder. The shadows became restless. The shadow beneath Susie's chair pulsed and darkened. Susie screamed, dropping her doll. Peppa grabbed Susie's hand. The shadow reached for Susie's leg. The kitchen turned into a trap. The girls ran into the living room. The room was quiet. The silence was deceptive. The couch's shadow melted onto the floor, turning into a flat black puddle. It slowly spread across the floor. From its center rose something, like a shapeless ink blot tentacle. Susie stared in horror. Peppa recoiled. The puddle slid toward them, stretching. Peppa shoved Susie toward the hallway door, but escape was a lie. Darkness awaited them there too. A mass of wallpaper was already partly oozing down under the stairs. An eye on a tentacle stared at them. The Shadow Eater had seeped out of the living room. Peppa and Susie ran toward the staircase. The eater tried to cut them off, sliding along the wall. Susie nearly fell. The pounding of footsteps, heavy breathing, the rising sounds of monsters. Peppa pulled Susie into the nursery and slammed the door. Black liquid seeped from underneath. A message appeared on the wall. "We are in the walls." George was there too. Black film covered his mouth. His black eyes shot open. The darkness had already consumed him. George's shadow tore away from the wall, forming a new eater. Susie screamed in terror. Peppa spotted a flashlight on the dresser. Bright light. In the flashlight beam, the Shadow Eater recoiled, writhing as it slithered under the door. The wallpaper, a giant mass with eyes, was stuck to the outside window. The flashlight flickered wildly and died. A wet, slurping sound echoed in the dark. Suddenly, Peppa's face with black eyes. "Your house has consumed the light." George was standing by an open, empty toy box, crying.
My dinosaur is gone.
When the main thing is lost, the scary awakens. Peppa entered the room, hugged her brother, and looked around. Peppa's gaze was drawn to something on George's bed, an old plush teddy bear covered in black liquid. She found not what she was looking for. The buttons on the bear were slightly trembling and turning toward Peppa. Black liquid slowly seeped from a seam under its ear. Suddenly, the bear threw out a paw tentacle and grabbed Peppa's hand. Peppa screamed and threw the bear away. It twitched on the floor, then ran off into the corridor. Peppa grabbed George's hand and ran after him. The chase had begun. Peppa and George wandered in the semi-darkness. On the walls, black paw prints. At the dark end of the corridor, a silhouette of a bear flickered. It disappeared behind the attic door. Where light did not reach, dwelled the keeper. Peppa took a flashlight from the wall. They slowly climbed up the creaky stairs. Along the edges, webs of black tentacles like veins of living darkness. The center of the hall was covered in cobwebs. In it sat the bear keeper, grown to Peppa's size. Around, old toys, dolls with empty eye sockets, cars with red headlights frozen in anticipation. All forgotten toys began to move slowly. Their heads and headlights turned toward Peppa and George. The bear keeper hissed in a low voice.
"Lost toys, your fault."
His mouth with needle-sharp teeth opened wide, black liquid pouring out. Tentacles from the bear lunged at Peppa. She dodged, throwing aside the box, and out rolled Dinosaur. George shouted and ran to him. Peppa turned on her flashlight at full brightness. Its beam blinded the keeper. He squealed. His tentacles recoiled. He ran into a crack in the floor. Peppa and George descended the stairs. They ran into their bedroom and slammed the door shut. It was quiet in the room. On Peppa's bed stood the bear keeper, but he was motionless. Next to him lay George's dinosaur with a grin of needle-sharp teeth. "They will come for you if you forget about them again." Peppa and Mom were choosing products from the shelves. Soon they noticed a figure in a dark cloak. Sometimes ordinariness concealed something else. The faceless shopper suddenly turned his head. Smooth gray skin was covered with cracks from which black liquid dripped and red dots flickered. Peppa nudged Mom.
Look,
Instead of the frightening figure, an ordinary shopper smiled and took a can of beans. Peppa approached the exit and looked outside. The cloak of the faceless one flashed in the doorway as he walked away down the street. He had already gone outside. Peppa stepped out onto the square. Among the passers-by, suddenly several faceless ones froze motionless. Gray faces with cracks and red dots flickered in the crowd. The crowd concealed their faces, but they harbored a great secret. One faceless one slowly raised his tentacle-like hand and pointed at Peppa. For a moment, all the passers-by distorted their faces, their skin pale. Cracks filled with black liquid and red dots flared up. Terrified, Peppa spun around and ran into a narrow alleyway. Peppa ran through the tight alley, panicking as she looked back. Black liquid was dripping down the walls, sticking to her little shoes. The streetlights flickered, but there wasn't enough light. Peppa froze at the door. For a moment, everything was completely silent. Only her rapid breathing could be heard. At that very moment, a faceless one leapt out of a puddle. His mouth opened in an inhuman grimace, and tentacles lunged into attack.
They stepped out into the rain. But this rain was different. The world around them was empty. A street lamp hummed faintly. Each drop carried darkness within it. A black puddle, like ink, spilled into reality. George leaned over the puddle. Emily grabbed his shoulder, stopping him.
Step back.
It seemed the puddle was fading, a false alarm. But in its reflection atop the raindrops, a black, hooded figure appeared. The group approached a bench. The rain intensified. The longer they stayed in the rain, the deeper the infection spread. A drop landed on Susie. Her hand turned blurry, translucent. Emily screamed, pulling it away. They vanished. Peppa noticed bubbles rising in the old well. Evie began to cry softly. Black liquid dripped from the corner of her mouth. She reached toward the well. Even the little one understood. Something was hiding there. From the puddles lining the path, tendrils slithered out, surrounding Susie and Emily. The darkness didn't just take, it held on. Peppa ran, shielding Evie with an umbrella. Emily broke free, but stumbled. Tendril grabbed her. Her scream echoed everywhere. In the glow of the street lamp stood the Dripper, massive, black droplets trailing down his cloak. He was the soul of this rain. He whispered.
Be with me forever.
Peppa, holding Evie in her arms, approached him, the umbrella raised like a shield. The final question, is it worth fighting, escape, or become the rain? Evie smiled.
Evie was drawing. Peppa was sitting nearby. "You're drawing very beautifully," said Peppa. "I tried to be just like you," replied Evie. The picture featured Peppa, but her smile was not her own. The next morning, Peppa woke up. George was looking in the mirror. "What's wrong with you?" asked Peppa. "There's someone else there," George answered emptily. In the evening, Peppa looked into the mirror. But behind her, someone else was standing. It was Evie, but she was taller and scarier. That night, Peppa woke up from a strange rustling in the room. George was no longer there. She quietly approached the mirror and saw a figure emerging from its depths. Distorted, it was Evie. Her legs, arms, and neck were very long. "Did you think you could stop me?" she hissed. Peppa tried to run, but suddenly several hands stretched out from the mirror and grabbed her. At that moment, her parents woke up. They heard the noise and rushed into the nursery. When they entered, they saw hands almost completely pulling Peppa into the mirror. Suddenly, she found herself inside a mirror world where only darkness reigned. Mama Pig and Papa Pig tried to help, but Evie caught them too. Moments later, the parents were lying on the floor, very pale and thin.
Welcome to my world. Now you are just reflections. I will replace you all.
In the evening, Peppa went home, but the road veered off to the side. She saw familiar faces, Susie, Rebecca, Denny, and new ones, pale and motionless. In the center of the circle, a puddle of black liquid reflecting the sky, but distorted. They stood silently, waiting. Peppa slowly approached. Susie turned her head abruptly without blinking. Her eyes, empty sockets, a black drop at the corner of her mouth. All the children simultaneously turned their heads toward Peppa, synchronously, faces devoid of emotion. The puddle in the center of the circle pulsed, gentle ripples emanating from it. Peppa stepped back. The children reached their hands out at the same time, their fingers elongated, black liquid flowing from them. The children's mouths opened to an unnatural width, but silently. The puddle in the center suddenly stretched upward, forming a black tentacle reaching toward Peppa. Peppa ran. When she looked back, everything had disappeared. But it was worse. Numerous trails of black slime led in different directions. Some led to Peppa's gate. Someone left with her, or followed her. Midnight, Peppa sat on her bed, drawing a circle in her notebook. A shadow near the door began to change. It was the silhouette of one of the children from the circle. Beyond the door, the park. That very park. Children in a circle. She was among them, standing hand in hand with the others. If Peppa isn't with them, then who is in the circle? Her eyes became as empty as Susie's. She slowly smiled. Suddenly, a face, blurred, eye sockets empty, mouth twisted into a grin, black liquid dripping, darkness flooding everything. You are already standing in the circle. You just don't know it yet. A normal day, Peppa and George are playing with dolls. One of them was strange. Its head was slightly tilted to the side. Peppa carefully turned the broken doll. A thin crack appeared on the face of the porcelain doll. Sometimes a small crack is just a premonition of something terrible. The light in the room flickered for a second. At that moment, Evie in the crib flinched and fell silent. She was no longer breathing evenly. Black liquid was dripping from the crack in the doll. Peppa ran to the crib, but it was empty. The outlines of tiny fingers had disappeared, replaced by cold fingerprints. A trail of black liquid stretched from the crib to the dollhouse. Horrified, Peppa took George's hand and led him there. In the central room sat the puppeteer, a figure with a porcelain face, but with cracks running all over its body. In its hands was Evie, like a doll, her eyes closed, unmoving. The puppeteer lifted its head and slowly opened its eyes. They glowed red. It stroked Evie's cheek and said,
My new doll.
Peppa and George froze as if held by an invisible force. The dollhouse continues to play, even if the players are silent. Doll Evie spoke in a creepy voice.
You are next.
Peppa and George spent the weekend at the country house. While their parents relaxed at home, they played in the garden.
George, let's go look for treasure.
They got carried away and dug too deep. Suddenly, they fell into some underground space. It resembled an underworld. Everything around exuded horror. Peppa and George walked along a dark corridor and emerged into a huge ritual hall. The room was lit by a red glow. Walls were draped with chains. Bones and skeletons lay scattered around, and in the center stood a table.
George, look! This must be a sacrificial altar.
Peppa, I think we should leave.
George muttered nervously.
Yes, right now.
Peppa said as if she had an idea, but George was already pulling her by the hand toward the exit. Suddenly, they realized they couldn't escape on their own.
Are we stuck here forever?
Don't cry. We'll figure something out.
Peppa said, and started calling for help. Their cries brought their parents running. They were furious, but helped the piglets get out. On the way home, Peppa enthusiastically told them about the ritual hall. Her excitement frightened George. Their parents just exchanged glances and laughed. That night, Peppa said,
George, I have something special.
She pulled a small bone from under her pillow. It was glowing with a bright green light.
Peppa, you're going to get into trouble.
George warned anxiously, but Peppa didn't listen and happily played with her find. Suddenly, the floor in the nursery cracked open into two parts, and from it emerged a gigantic skeleton with red eyes, a terrible smile, black claws, and red tentacles behind its back.
You stole my bone. You will pay for this.
It said in a demonic voice. The skeleton grabbed Peppa's hand and lifted her toward the ceiling. Meanwhile, Dad and Mom Pig were sitting in the living room reading books. Suddenly, Evie ran into the room.
Bear! Where is my bear, Mommy?
Honey, he's probably lost again among your toys. Let's go find him.
Mommy Pig picked up Evie in her arms, and they headed to her room. When they opened the door, they froze in horror. Everything in the room was upside down. Walls were scratched with claws, and in the middle of the room hung Bear on a rope with black crosses instead of eyes.
My bear!
Sweetheart, it's just some evil joke.
Mom said nervously. Suddenly, they heard wild screams from Peppa's and George's nursery. The room was in chaos. George was hanging in a net in the upper corner of the room with white eyes as if hypnotized. Peppa was standing against the wall with black eyes and a creepy smile. She was whispering some spell and scratching something on the wall with a bone. Dad Pig was lying on the floor and barely managed to say, "Run!" In the center stood an ominous skeleton. It turned toward the door and whispered in that same chilling demonic voice,
Oh, we have guests. You're just in time. I just finished with these little pigs.
Peppa and George decided to take a walk in the forest and stumbled upon an old, abandoned house. It looked very gloomy. Broken windows, overgrown bushes, creaky door. Inside, it was dark and cold. Cracked portraits hung on the walls. Their eyes seemed alive. Suddenly, it became dark outside the window. At that moment, a strange woman appeared. The owner of the house. Her face was pale, and her eyes were cold and frightening. She smiled strangely and said,
Welcome. You shouldn't have come here.
Suddenly, she began to change. Her face distorted. Her eyes shone with bright red light, and something black flowed out of them. Peppa tried to run, but the door slammed shut by itself. The demon owner grabbed Peppa and George with her long claws. Their screams disappeared into the darkness. Everything around started to distort. The house's owner dragged the children into her dark basement. Peppa and George were tied up. Their mouths were covered with rags. The owner was boiling something murky in a huge cauldron and muttered,
Soon I will enjoy this.
Peppa turned around and saw Susie and Rebecca. They were also tied up and trembling with fear. Suddenly, a familiar, sinister whisper sounded. The door opened. Standing in the doorway was Evie, with tentacles and a sinister smile. She grabbed the house owner with one of her tentacles and swallowed her with a sinister sound. Afterward, Evie smiled sweetly but continued to radiate horror. The children were scared. They already knew what awaited them. Evie wasn't full yet and was planning to fix that.